So there's like this game of cat and mouse of which teams are trying to bootstrap the community by deciding like where value should flow, right? And but also when. I think I think the biggest utility of airdrops is to cut through the noise, right? In an era of which there's things being locked all the time, right? Why is anyone going to pay attention to your thing? So one of the biggest problems of this kind of performance-based marketing, right, is that it really incentivizes bad publishers to fake traffic. When we think about monetization, we think about monetizing intention and not attention.
Welcome to the Bare Metal Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning back into the Bare Metal Podcast. I'm your Ship the Code from Rockway X Labs. And today I've got here with me Sean Braithwaite of old, who's been here before. I'm super happy welcoming him back. Hey Sean.
It's good to be back.
So let's talk about what's new with you guys. Last time you were here, co-founder of Mekatek. A lot of things have changed.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked last time I was here, it was right when we were designing the builder module. So in essence, we were trying to experiment with PDS and try and extend the supply chain to include a new role, right? Which is going to be the builder. We wanted builders to be staked and accountable for the kind of behavior that they conducted. And yeah, we built that, we released that. I think it was explored by a bunch of teams. But in the end, we decided it was like not really what we wanted to do. And in particular, it was not really right for the community because it didn't have the kind of censorship resistant properties, right, that I think that most teams were looking for. So after we released the builder module and took that feedback, we did a lot of soul searching and tried to understand like how the work that we were doing was like aligned with our mission. So of course, the mission of Mekatek in the end is to find the balance between individual opportunity and joint utility in competitive blockchains. And we asked ourselves if like optimizing block space was the right thing. Like, is that the thing? Is that where we really want to deliver value? Considering that like across the interchain of all the chains that are producing blocks every 6 seconds, right? Some of these chains that are running for a year, most are empty. I think the argument was clearly made that this was like not a place that particularly needed to be optimized, right? There's a lot of work to be done in terms of incentives. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of figuring out where value flows and who it flows to, right? And I think there was like a bigger opportunity outside of block space for us. So we decided to try something else.
Right, so value flows. We've had a lot of conversation around those. I'm interested, can you talk about where, if you're trying to grab value flows, around blockchains, like where do you go looking? Right, so everybody focused on this block space and this MEV side, but there obviously like there's a lot of value around blockchains.
Well, it depends where you look. Like if you're looking at if you're looking like Ethereum, right? If you're looking at Ethereum, MEV is actually a good place to look because the MEV budget is almost as much as it pays for security. It's probably like 50% emissions, 50% fees, whatever, in sort of like that mature ecosystem. In newer ecosystems, they kind of they leverage their balance sheet in completely different ways, right? So obviously we know that emissions are effectively a tax on unstaked tokens, right? So that is often like the main tool that people use or that teams use to incentivize the behavior that they want, right? One of those behaviors is securing the network, right? So we know, of course, the security budgets for a lot of L1s is in double-digit percentage of the network value per year. So if you have like 20% inflation, right, of $1 billion network is $200 million
a year.
Yeah. So obviously this has been one of the conversations that has been evolving right in the ecosystem, especially on the Cosmos Hub, that produces very little transaction, very little fees, right? They were, dramatically overpaying for security, and they changed that, right? They lowered the average inflation. And then I guess the third category, so the first category would be like established Ethereum. Second category would be established inflationary, right? Third category are like chains that are not really launched yet. And I think chains that are not really launched yet, one of the tools that teams use to sort of bootstrap their community is to airdrop, where they essentially take 10 to 15%, or 5 to 10%, I would say, of the FTV, and they, let's say, give it away. And now, of course, the meta on airdrops is evolving, that teams are trying to get smarter about who they airdrop and how, right? But in general, it's like a pure dilutive event where you try and make it juicy enough to like cut through the noise of crypto Twitter, right? But not too big that you can't recover from the ensuing sell pressure. So there's like this game of cat and mouse of which teams are trying to bootstrap the community by deciding like where value should flow, right? But also when.
Right. I'm not an expert in airdrops, but it seems super challenging today to actually design an airdrop to be useful. Oftentimes airdrops are driven by data like, whoever stakes Atom or whoever does this, like very simple rules. Sometimes I see, requirements that actually make sense, like has participated in a certain campaign, but it all seems like super early days. And it feels to me, I don't know what your take is, but it's more like a shotgun approach.
I think I think the biggest utility of airdrops is to cut through the noise, right? In an era of which there's things being launched all the time, right? Why is anyone going to pay attention to your thing, right? If it's like a pure product utility, obviously the products that are being released in this vintage of blockchains are, dramatically more useful than the ones that came before. But there's like so much coming up now that it's very difficult to like hold the spotlight long enough to educate a population of that value proposition. So essentially airdrops are mainly a tool for teams to grab that spotlight and ideally hold on to it to have their moments, right? Where they have some kind of exclusive attention, right? Where they can tell their story or even build a story. So I think that they are, in varying degrees of sophistication. I think like the nut that everyone's trying to crack, right, is how to project the initial value of an airdrop, of the spend, right, over time.
Right.
So not just how to incentivize like passive behavior, right, like I'll just LP here, but active behavior and even integrate things like vesting. So if you think about airdrops as more like distribution events, right, almost similar to like you're essentially doing like a formation of your community through capital or capital formation, right? And you would never do capital formation without vesting, right? You probably have some kind of liquidation preference or whatever over time. So I think this is the big part that it's not just about who do you airdrop to, but like what do they do once they have them?
Once they have the airdrop. Yeah, it almost feels like, would it be fair to say, teams might benefit from like a sort of return on investment framework? Like in some sense, it's an investment into the community, right? You're airdropping some tokens out.
Yeah.
And you're hoping the community is going to somehow then return the return favor at some point in time.
Absolutely. So I think, at Filament, we look at it through the lens of like customer acquisition cost and lifetime value, right? So we look at it through the equation of like, we expect, if you decide that if you were to measure or calculate all the trading fees generated on for a month or actually forever, and then divide that by the number of users, right? You could actually estimate what the value of a trader is.
Lifetime value of users, right?
Yeah. And then like the question of like how much you should spend to acquire a trader, right, is at a growth stage company, right, up to that number.
So you just said Filament. You guys, Filament is a new topic. So tell us what's Filament.
Oh, sorry, that was very pretentious. So Filament is a joint venture between Mekatek and Numino, which we develop tools to drive growth, to design, build, and deploy incentives, right, and help the ecosystem as a whole grow. So we're doing sort of two things mainly. If you open up like Capital Dashboard, you're going to see a display ad, right, that's powered by Filament. So we've worked very close with Kepler and other publishers, including Leap, right, to find the right mix of like legitimate projects that actually bring utility to the user, right, and then give them space in valuable publisher platforms like Kepler, right.
Do you guys do the creative work as well, or do you focus do you help craft the message, or are you guys sort of focused on distribution there?
So right now it's like very full service. So we take on customers and sort of hold their hand through the process of designing a segment, figuring out what the right objectives are, how to measure success and how to craft a message to achieve that success.
Do you guys do A/B testing of different messages to actually experiment and iterate on this?
So we don't do A/B testing right now, but one thing we do is we do cohort pullback. So what we do when we run a campaign, right, is we ensure that one, it's like aligned with the values of the publisher, right, of Kepler. We craft the message to give them the best success of like reaching that audience based on the aggregated sort of experience that we've accumulated working on multiple projects, right? So like some people are only thinking about doing this for one project, so that's like their maximum experience, right? We've done this for 20 plus clients, so we could like aggregate the experience of knowing what works. And then once we've designed the segments, right, we will actually split the segments into like a live and a holdout, right? So specifically, we show like maybe 90% of the segment will actually show ads to, and 10% we won't. And then whatever metric that we decide, right, we deem as a measure of success, we measure that against the holdouts, right? So we're trying to capture what is like the latent propensity to perform an action versus like the value that Kepler is adding by showing the user this message.
Actually showing that. So it's like a control group designed for
control
experiments.
Yeah. So the idea is, I mean, with most of our customers, we run campaigns more continuously, right? So we're constantly learning, right? So it's kind of like every campaign is an A/B test.
So you're sequentially You're sequentially iterating on what the best message is to reach the users. So I think this is the first time I've heard of basically something that I can think of as an ad network in the Web3 space. Is that true, or is there
I think there are like so there are many ad networks in crypto, right? Like if you open up CoinMarketCap, you're going to see an ad network, right? You're going to see a display ad. I think there's like a difference between like large scale ad networks and like the boutique kind of service that we're offering, right? Insofar as like we see our publishers as partners, right? And we really integrate them at every stage of the process. And this is very different than like most ad networks. Like the incentives for ad networks are essentially to have as much volume and as much publishers as possible, right? And to sell impressions, right? And that incentivizes essentially the bad publishers to fake traffic. So one of the biggest problems of this kind of like performance-based marketing, right, is that it really incentivizes bad publishers to fake traffic. For this reason, what Filament does is like our rev share is based on actual engagement and eventually going to be on LTVs. We want to align the whole supply chain. So essentially, we only win, right, when the customer wins.
The customer wins, right? And that's why that control group is super important.
Yeah.
That's where the control group is super important to compute sort of the actual effect of the campaign.
So when we think about monetization, we think about monetizing intention and not attention.
That's an interesting take. So trying to understand what the user wants to do, help him accomplish the task, and then grab a reward on that. Okay, super interesting. So that's how, I guess, when you were talking about incentives and then sort of the communication, in my mind it's still an ad network. I'm thinking about the ad network. That's how the ad network's actually coupled with sort of thinking about the incentives.
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially in crypto, right, I think to really capture someone's, like intention, you really have to incentivize a certain kind of engagement. And I think that one of the things that every team is trying to figure out is like, what actually is the price for that? I think that, we talked briefly about how most teams, right, like, or most protocols overpay for security, right? But in many ways they overpay for kind of everything because it's like almost like seems like not real money. Like the wormhole airdrop is going to be, I think, 2 billion or something like that. Some insane amount. Right?
Seems
most about 50 million or whatever, which is just an insane spend, right, for marketing. And there's a huge division between like what a team would spend like per year on marketing, on like sponsoring events, versus their airdrop, right? And I think this is not the way. I think that we think of growth as a more iterative experimental thing. So probably like more continuous. Like even if you airdrop once and you capture users, like what's going to happen when you have a competitor?
Well, they'll airdrop right after you, and right,
Yeah,
so you capture some of that attention back.
exactly. Like I think that there is going to be there is like an incentive war that is taking place, and you can see that with Stride and Milky Way. So Milky Way launches the first liquid staking derivative of TIA, and then I think it was 2 weeks later, Stride comes out and commits to deploying 5% of your FTV to incentivize liquidity on TIA. A week later, essentially, I think the first week Milky Way acquired around 40 million in TVL, and after the first week of Stride incentives being live, they had acquired 50 million in SDTI, and you can see by the graph that it cost $20 million essentially for Stride to acquire 50 million in liquidity.
Right.
Now, is that efficient? Like, is that as efficient?
Is it sustainable?
Is it sustainable on the retention? Yeah, I don't know. Like the way that we think about it at Filament, like growth and defensibility is like there is an incentive war, right? At Filament, we are the arms dealers, as in like obviously we sell services to everyone because we believe that a competitive landscape is what creates innovation. And then on one side, you have your shield, right? You have your community, you have your products, your product quality, right? The pure utility that it has, right? And then you have like your sword, right? Obviously, where your sword is incentives. So obviously it's great to have like a great product and a great community, but sometimes you need to swing your sword, and Stride swung their sword in a big way, and it put them into the number one position of liquid staking derivatives for probably the biggest Cosmos ecosystem project. So
right, I mean, like when you think of it this way, right, and you said that there are incentive wars and sort of big airdrops, going back to the wormhole idea. Once you think about this in terms of you have to find the right group and find what their intention actually is,
yes,
and then target, like it really already sounds inefficient in many ways, right? I mean, because you don't know who the segment that's going to react is yet. You don't know the size of the effect. You might need to iterate to like find the right group of people and actually what they're going to react to. So sort of doing this airdrop in one shot, is that going to be a foregone thing, you think, or is that here to stay? Like, do we need a new system?
So my expectation is that if you're a growth stage company, you should spend as much as you're up to your LTV, and that's until you're out of growth stage. So I don't think Ethereum should do this, right? I think that probably, when you're launching, you probably exceed your LTV because you don't really know it, right? And I think the biggest risk is being irrelevant, not diluting, right?
Right.
But if you are at this growth stage that you're going to deploy, you should deploy your cap table insofar as it is efficient. Now, what is that measure of efficiency? Like you can see what teams like Chaos Labs have done to measure the efficiency of, for instance, liquidity incentives.
So can you elaborate on that? I'm not familiar.
So Osmosis, right, is a DEX that everyone knows and loves. In order to, like, the way it works is liquidity is provided by users. They're called liquidity providers, and they contribute liquidity to the protocol such that people can trade against it in this sort of AMM design. The problem with being a liquidity provider is that you expose yourself to impermanent loss. Right. So you take a fixed position, right, and you essentially are uninformed, right, and then coming after you is informed order flow that has like more information, and it knows what the real price is and will trade against you, and you're just supposed to sit there and take it, right? A lot of the time that the price movement, right, the informed order flow, it hurts your position to the point that cannot be exceeded by the fees you collect.
To which there was an analysis on Uniswap where I believe 1 year, was it 2022, traders have lost an aggregate of 100 million, including the fee, even if you include the fees in, right? Just
the fees. Yeah. So that was the carve-out analysis, right? That tried to estimate, if you had left at your position, like people stayed in, but if you had left, like where your
what would be the difference? Yeah.
Yeah. So since then, I think the products have gotten smarter. So what Osmosis did, right, to actually what all DEXs do, so Dimension is doing this as well, is they essentially deploy their balance sheet to incentivize liquidity position emissions. So those like APR numbers that you see are not so like if you go on Osmosis DEX, you're going to see like, oh, there's liquidity in this pool. What do I get for providing liquidity? You're going to see a number. That number is APR. That APR is usually an aggregate of like native yields from
like trading fees,
just the fees, trading fees, but also the emissions. So initially, like the initial distribution of Osmosis, it was like 50% of emissions was directed to liquidity, right? So you could argue they dramatically overpaid for liquidity, but they corrected that by working with a firm called Chaos Labs. And what Chaos Labs did is they looked at like essentially what is the proper amount of liquidity to ensure what you want, and what you want is essentially ensure proper execution quality for the user, right? So
on the LP side,
execution quality. Big pardon?
On the LP side, right?
On the LP side, yeah. So how much liquidity actually do you need to provide a good experience? Like, do you need hundreds of millions, right, of liquidity if you're just doing, $10 trades? Obviously not. So like, there's a model here. So people are actually modeling this out and trying to determine like how it's more efficient. And in addition to that, of course, concentrated liquidity on the Osmosis side is also with this in mind of like sort of moving liquidity only where it needs to be, such that you need less, right, to provide the service that you want, which is execution quality. So projects are getting smarter, right? But in aggregate, we are still dramatically overpaying because it's not only about the execution, it's also about getting the attention of like taking on that initial risk of using the platform.
Right, incentivizing the beta users, the guys who risk their money to test the smart contract. So even if that, I once heard a quote, remember who it was, that was like, so degens are the beta testers of the new financial infrastructure.
100%.
Right. So they risk their money in the hope of these high returns, and these high returns need to be there for them to be actually like be willing to risk this money, right? So do you feel like you're still overpaying, even if that's the case?
So am I overpaying even if it's attract degens?
Yeah. So I mean, even like, as you're saying, like the incentives need to also cover the fact that the users are these sort of early people who risk their capital using the platform. Can have any number of bugs and whatever. But you still feel, even though that's the case, you still feel we're overpaying, right? Although like it feels to me, to incentivize people to actually go and try something new, those incentives need to be pretty high. Like otherwise, like I don't want to risk my capital.
I think a $2 billion airdrop is too much. I think that 50% of emissions for multiple years was too much. That was overpaying. I think that's been proven that overpaying. I don't know how like subjective. I think we could agree, that was too much. Whether they're overpaying now, that's a little bit more subjective. It depends on like where you are in the growth curve. It depends like how competitive the landscape is. Like if
Where do you think Osmosis is on the growth curve? You've said that a few times. Where do you think, this growth curve idea? Let's, benchmark a couple of projects. Like you talk about Ethereum, obviously mature project, right? Where do you think Osmosis is on the growth curve? Where is the hub on the growth curve?
So I think Osmosis has a lot of room to grow. I mean, it is technically. I'll show some Osmosis some more. Right? I think Osmosis has a lot of room to grow because it is one of the most advanced DEXs from a technical standpoint. I don't think people give a shit about that, right? And the reality is, the problem with Osmosis, it is still viewed as being in Cosmos, right? And there just isn't enough price discovery events in Cosmos to make money in DeFi. Right?
AKA, there's very little DeFi in Cosmos in total.
Yeah, I think that, so as a DEX, well, like most DeFi protocols, they make their money very sporadically, and they make their money like during these liquidity, price discovery events, like whatever you're discovering. And in general, it's not just that there aren't very many tokens launched in Cosmos, right? I think like we had this very quick, like it wasn't even like a inscription summer. It was like an inscription,
spring.
Like it was very, very short, right? Where everyone was excited. about inscriptions as a platform potentially to use the Cosmos Hub, right, for something despite people's efforts to keep it useless. But the reality is it just didn't work as an integrated space, right? So I think that until there are more sort of like price discovery, there's more demand for price discovery, like as in people care about figuring out what the price of these things are, right? In Cosmos, I don't think I think this is a problem that Osmosis needs to solve, right? And that's not about product quality. There's like this other thing. So I think it's a very high quality product, but it has a lot of room to grow in terms of revenue, in terms of liquidity, right? It figures out like what price it wants to discover. The other thing that I would say is like, so first of all, like there's no such thing as product market fit in crypto, right? Things change all the time. Things all change all the time. And I'll give you an example.
So wait a minute. You're saying, let me get this straight. You're saying it doesn't even make any sense to target product market fit because the market's going to be in a different place once you fit today's market. Is that what you're saying?
I think in crypto you just can't talk about it as a monotonic trajectory. As in, you can't assume that once you found product market fit that you're going to keep it.
Okay, so there is PMF, but it's a moving target.
It's a moving target, yeah. But I think what you're talking about is like, okay, first comes, growth and then product market fit, and then we monetize, right?
Right.
This would be sort of a
like a Web 2 style, right?
Yeah. But I mean, in crypto, right, where everything is open source and, the capital markets dictate that there's going to be an experiment of everything. We're just doing grid search to figure out what works, right? It means that, your competitive landscape will change overnight. And you don't just see that with very small protocols, you see that with the biggest protocols. So, Maker had to increase their SDR rate to like 15%.
Right, the savings rate, the DAI savings rate. To incentivize people who die.
Right. Yeah, because of the emergence of Athena. Like there's like this, tokenized fund called Athena.
That's a big APY.
Yeah,
Athena 60% on stables.
Where's the risk?
Yeah, I guess liquidity risk holding shorts on Binance. I don't even know where I don't know where they're trading the perps.
They have like a list of exchanges. 40% of the liquidities on Binance, and then there's over 5 other exchanges.
Right. No. What I was saying is, I'm not saying they're hiding. What I was saying is, I didn't check. It's just you see this huge number, you're like, oh, I'm sorry. No, but anyway, look, let's go back to the incentives conversation, right? Because I think what you're saying is interesting and it has real impacts on this like incentives design if you think about it like long term, right? Does that mean like as the like essentially as the market's evolving, new products come online, you have to really keep iterating and thinking about how your users are going to interact with you and just keep like redesigning and iterating on all your communication all the time.
You have to develop. I think that you in order to be competitive, you need to do 2 things. You need to iterate on like your supply chain of figuring out like what kind of users that you actually need, as in like change your segmentation or change your definition, like update your model of what it takes to actually produce value. Like where is liquidity in the supply chain? Where are relayers? Where are builders? Where are searchers? Like how does that work? Right? And then you need to figure out like what to pay them. Like you need to do price discovery on their service, right? And this is very competitive because liquidity can always go somewhere else. Searchers can always go somewhere else, right? Traders can always go somewhere else. What do you charge them? It depends on like what kind of alternatives they have. They're like those things you do not control. You do not control the number of options, right? That are going to be available.
People have,
to the number
sure.
of competitors. Yeah.
Unless you're Sam Altman and you're figuring out how to do regulatory capture for OpenAI.
But I mean, this is what Sam is doing. So they started out as
OpenAI,
a nonprofit, right? And then they we need a lot more money to do this, right? We need to change the way that we capitalize, right? And they created this, bullshit structure that has all these governance pathologies that, was good enough to deliver one of the most innovative products the world's ever seen, right? In terms of I don't think there's any product that has ever acquired 100 million users faster than ChatGPT.
No, I think they're fastest in terms of growth. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they looked what they first they have to recapitalize and then decide like how much money, and now they're figuring out who they need to pay. They're changing their supply chain. So like Sam is raising, let's say, $1 trillion to start investing in chips. ChatGPT. So I mean, one of the biggest growth products, right? And they're going to have to innovate on the supply chain. Like they have to go into chips and figure out how to secure the kind of compute that they need to build the kind of product that they want.
Right. I mean, you're referring to sort of now verticalizing in the stack and going down and optimizing it. No, what I was talking about in terms of regulatory capture is trying to set up the rules now so it's hard to follow them in. Because you'll have all these rules around developing new AI. He's already got all the ethics teams, the legal teams, right, to make sure they're okay. And he's already talking to Congress. So it feels like this came into my head when you said you can't control the other options that people have, right? Which is, it's in some sense, I think that's what he's trying to do.
Actually, you know what? I agree with you. There are cases of which you become a certain size, of which, like, if you include the government in your supply chain, you can pull up the ladder.
Yeah, pull up ladder is, I think, a formulation I've heard used before with OpenAI. Anyway, so like, but let's get back to crypto and Web3, right? So like the my takeaway from this is, I was thinking in my head of like building products as already hard in Web3. Yeah, you got this additional platform, you got these smart contracts. Originally, this was supposed to be easier, but I'm not entirely sold on the idea that it is. Well, that's what I heard. Look, smart contract. When I came to crypto, right? Smart contracts you don't need a backend platform. It's all going to be so easy. You're just going to launch your smart contract on this unshakable computer, right? That's gonna solve all your problems, and then you just build a front end for that. That was my understanding of before, starting to write stuff. But in fact, you need indexers, you need backends, you need to make sure you're serving up fresh data. You need to have your own RPC nodes because you want to interact with the chain sanely. Whether those are yours or you're paying for them. Actually, it turns out even on the technical side, there's a bunch of moving parts, right? Frequently software it's operated, etc. It makes the Kubernetes upgrade schedule at AWS look timid by comparison. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, so I would say that anyone who's working on like incentives has tried to do something very simple that was damn near impossible, which is query historic state. So, like, I think there are
there are no archive nodes. Yeah.
There's 3 archive nodes in existence of Osmosis, right? They are protected by armed guard and operated by simply staking, right? And you have to pay them 10% of your cap table to use them. Yeah. Okay, that seems that does seem excessive as incentives or as no, but I think it goes down to something deeper, that like when we create these state machines, right? Like state machines are very inefficient computation, right? Because it has to be
replicated.
To all these things going through consensus. It has to be stored in this Merkle tree structure, right? Which is super expensive and difficult
for IOPS, 100%.
Yeah. There are blockchains that obviously they innovate on this and like don't write to Merkle trees. There's UTXO models, but the reality is that keeping historic state is not really what blockchains are optimized for. Even though it is like a treasure trove of information that you would want to use for your to shape your incentives, right? The idea of deciding how value flows based on such a myopic view of like just this block, just this now. Even just this chain, right? But
look, the major problem is, I feel like here it's very clear. It's a simple, it's a very clear cut problem. Running an archive node, thus like massively increasing your storage requirements, is an immediate cost for operators.
Yeah.
For anybody who's validating the chain who's running this node. On the other hand, there's no real market for this old data until somebody comes like a boutique shop and says, oh, actually, I'm the first person in like 3 years to realize I want to know what these users have been doing for a while. And there's no market for this stuff. And it's very hard to create one. I think it's quite, whenever an operator does this whole of like balance sheet computation in their head, like, do I spend this much extra to get, additional 8 tera of drives and keep around this state? And like you see the expenditure, like where's the flip side, right? Where's the income? And this goes back, by the way, to this idea we're overpaying tons for security for all the operators that are pruning their blocks. but there's no real models. And we've tried, talking to foundations occasionally, and like, hey, do you want to pay for specific kinds of services, like some running decentralized RPCs by some operators? There are all these things that can be additionally done, but it's actually hard to incentivize them in today's space. Maybe because there's no demand for this data. Once it becomes normalized, because you guys will be doing data analysis and trying to target cohorts on all chains, then I can see, there could be more demand. There'd be more interesting to run these nodes. But right now there isn't.
Yeah, I think there is like a chicken and egg problem, right? That because it's not available, people don't think about using that data, right? And because people are not using that data, no one supplies it.
But even big ecosystems like Ethereum will tell you there are always so we need a certain amount of history. Like now, Ethereum blockchain is considering like shortening the block history that's kept by full nodes, right? And like, so who's going to keep this? Well, there are always players who are incentivized to do this, like blockchain explorers. So there'll always be a few copies around. It's always hand waving, right? It's always like, oh, somebody's going to run those because they'll have an off-chain incentive model to do that. I don't know, like maybe in Ethereum that's true, but on these smaller chains, I just don't see it.
I think this is something that was like, I think this is something that changed with innovation of ZK. So it used to be like ZK and coprocessors were infeasible. Like it was actually, they were too slow to imagine doing sort of the credible queries on historic data. I don't know if it's true anymore. I think that there are several providers now that are sort of positioning themselves to be ready to support exactly this kind of functionality in a credible way. So of course you can be like Dune Analytics has credible data, right? There are snapshots, like Numia provides snapshots of Osmosis data in BigQuery, right? And so this is, if you trust Numia, which you like for all intended purposes, you should, right? As many projects have already done so, as they supported all the data for all the snapshots.
Especially if you're in a B2B relationship, right?
Yeah. I think this is great, and I think this covers that part of the incentive budget, right? But if you were to say, like, think about like block rewards or trading rewards, like for instance, if you wanted to charge trading fees that were determined by your average trading volume per week or something like this, to smooth out, value of construction. If you wanted to do that in like an epochal type way, in the same way that Osmosis does calculate rewards, not every block, but every once a day, Osmosis stalls for a couple minutes to do this complex.
There's a long block. Yep.
Yeah. That's that. I think it does that because it didn't really have a choice, because there wasn't these services did not exist, right? That could do off-chain computation in a much more efficient way and then just provide the proof. So that's going to change.
Sure. I agree with that. Like, I think ZK, in terms of like serving privileged data, ZK is a really interesting sort of primitive which you can use to query data that's verified. You can recompute some hashes from the query, but then also supply the result that's guaranteed to be an honest computation. It's got this SNARK certificate. But I mean, that's an interesting idea. I guess maybe this will spawn a market for this type of older data. But look, I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, disk space is expensive even today, like in these numbers, and especially like if think of projects like these new L2 guys. Like I just had Rushi from Movement Labs. They're going to be producing tons of data, right? They want to parallelize, they want to increase the space. And that's actually the big constraint today, right? I mean, not necessarily running multi-threaded, but actually increasing the state size is what costs a lot of money. So they're hoping to offload this to a DA that's fast, like EigenDA. But again, that keeps your data for a couple of weeks. It's a data availability solution. So then you need to offload it to storage somewhere, and you still have the volume problem. And like it's going to be it is just plain expensive to keep all of that data around. So I like, unless a market comes up to like for this data, I still don't understand how you can manage this.
Well, I think there's the benefit is that if you're not doing things synchronously, so I guess like consensus is a synchronous process where like you have like a certain amount of time to do it. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Like there are timeouts, there are time limits, right? These time limits don't exist for archival data. Like if Celestia holds your data for a week, that means you have like a week for the ETL to move it into BigQuery or
Yes.
something more credible, right? Which is very feasible from a computer science perspective.
100%. Yeah.
I don't think it's feasible to store data, to synchronously store data in the right format for incentives, right? In consensus. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that's a bad idea. I think that should be moved.
It's needlessly expensive, right? Absolutely. Yeah. I'd agree. So, where do you see this whole space of incentives and airdrops going? Do you think there's going to be more uptake of Filament-like approaches, or is it going to be free for all?
I think we've seen a lot of evolution already. So we've seen stuff that works, like Blast, right, where they put sort of incentives at like the core of their value proposition by also embedding it into the state machine. We've seen it not work, right? We've seen sort of Evmos try and embed incentives, like essentially have value flows go to smart contract developers to incentivize, building on Evmos. So Evmos provides fundamentally like an undifferentiated product, which is EVM block space. There's lots of EVM block space. Like, why would you build on it? Evmos, maybe like incentives could fix that. These did not work. And then there are cases.
Why do you think, by the way, why do you think it didn't work? Because that's an interesting question. I think Archway is trying to run the same model, right? But I don't think it's on EVM. I think they have Cosmosm, but that's, in some sense, that's a detail. Like you're saying, like, I'm going to design this blockchain. Sorry?
The number was too low. Like the amount they pay developers in practice is too low. Like they did not pass like the price.
Enough of the value onwards. That's what you're saying. Okay. Interesting. So it was just a mismanaged sort of number or bad guess in terms
I think it was just, but I don't know how they came up. I mean, they had like a whole methodology, especially with their rec drop. It was probably one of the most sophisticated airdrops, right? So they did all these weird queries and tried to compensate, essentially give gas rebates to users or whatever to incentivize people. But it wasn't, I think it was just like that vintage of the learning. And I think the main problem is not the scheme that you come up with, right? But how many like shots at it you get and like how fast you are to iterate. And I think like whether you're talking about Berachain, Blast, or Evmos, you can talk about them as a certain vintage or like how much success they've achieved. The question is like how sticky is that success? Like the idea that whatever success they achieve is going to last, right? Is TBD. In reality, they're going to have to evolve. Like even though that Evmos with all this work doing all these queries, right? They're going to kind of have to do that again if they're going to want another shot at this, because they're going to have to be more competitive than the newer generation, right? The Blast and the Berachains.
Do you think the Berachain incentive model was successful?
It's too early to tell. I think that like in terms of like this shield and sword analog, I think that the Berachain community is amazing. I think they've done probably one of the strongest teams in sort of building community. I think that's valuable. That's worth something. I think the product has a lot of things that could be hard that they've made very smooth, right? And I think that the incentives scheme that they've proposed, because it's not live, so it's impossible to say whether it worked or did not work, right? But I think it's directionally interesting, right? Because what they're really trying to do is solve the biggest cold start problem, which is bringing in liquidity. So maybe we should say like, what is the Berachain incentive scheme, right? Let me show Berachain for a moment. So Berachain, right, is an EVM blockchain, right, built in Cosmos. So it's an undifferentiated product on its surface. But the differentiation at the product level is this sort of native incentive scheme that they've built. So Berachain is built on a novel proof of liquidity. So what they've done is they said, okay, why would I force my users to decide between securing the network and participating in DeFi? Bad trade-off, right? This is something that people speculated on back in the day that was going to be a risk, and this is why we created liquid staking tokens. But like in an era in which we're looking for innovative approaches, they said, okay, instead of liquid staking tokens, which will probably do as well, let's instead incentivize people to bring liquidity first. So the way it works is you stake liquidity to their DEX, and then you get these BGT tokens. And these BGT tokens are not like market tokens; you can't transfer them, but you could use those to stake, right? And those things are actually what determine like, what validator produces how many blocks, right? So that actually secures. And also those validators determine where they direct emissions. So instead of emissions being split between stakers and the validator, right? They're actually directed back to the DeFi protocols. So the incentives, so if you like are LPing on Berachain DEX, which is called I don't know what, right? But actually it works for all DeFi protocols on Berachain, apparently. You get these extra incentives that are being directed through this DPoS system called proof of liquidity. So in the end, what you want to do is you want to say like, hey, come build in this ecosystem. You can build anywhere, but build here because we solve two problems for you, right? One, bootstrap liquidity, and two, we'll help you with incentives. We'll give you like this incentive capability sort of natively.
But so riddle me this. I'm stuck in my head still on the idea that it's actually the validators delegating now in some sense, right? If you were thinking of these DPoS, it's now the validators have these tokens and they are so delegated proof of stake. So the validators are deciding where the incentives go. Like, what do you think is the mental model for a validator to make this decision? Like, what do you think the validator is doing?
So what they want to do is, maybe I should have mentioned this in the first sort of monologue. My first part of my Berachain shill should have included this part, which is that like they have this bribe system where what they want is for protocols to bribe validators, right, with call options on their token. So please, chorus one, direct your incentives to my lending protocol and I'll give you some tokens at some strike price that is favorable to you.
Wow. Okay. So actually, it's not the validators sort of trying to decide where to move this. It's a conversation between the DeFi protocols that are active on Berachain that are actually, in some sense, bidding or somehow attracting the validators to direct the rewards to them.
Yep.
So in this system, sort of a lot of the value still accrues to the validators, but since these are call options, I guess it's not as you're not actually sending sort of unlocked tokens out.
Correct.
You are aligning them to grow with you in some sense.
Yes.
It seems super complicated, by the way, but it's sort of I'm trying to see. It does make some sense.
I mean, it's the meta. And I think that, at Filament, we've been looking at multiple mechanisms for long-term alignment, right? Like this idea of dropping tokens on users and expecting the best. I think we know where that goes, right? I think innovating on the mechanism, I think is important, right? What Berachain is doing, I think we need to wait and see how it plays out, but it has like, it smells like innovation, it could be cool. But the question is like, how easy is it going to be to adapt, right? Why do we need like a whole new chain to experiment with this? Like, isn't this something that kind of like is Berachain fundamentally the only chain that has this problem? No, I don't think so. I think every chain kind of had this problem. This is just one thing that
one way to solve it. Right.
This is the playbook that they are writing to see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the argument that you were talking about, where if the playbook is baked into the protocol, it's much harder to actually iterate on it and play with it. I totally get your point that it's it makes more sense to sort of be faster, try multiple waves of this and see what sticks. It's really I've never thought of incentives deeply, to be honest, and this is a super interesting chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation on like we're just getting out of a bear market now, right? And we're also in this macroeconomic condition where money costs something, right? With interest rates, at 5%, the cost of capital actually matters, right? I think that in launching all these tokens, we haven't really been forced to think hard and fast on how we spend them, right? They've always seemed like this abundant resource, even though we've experienced cases of which they're absolutely not. I think that Osmosis experienced that, the emissions being as high as they were, right, had real consequences. I think the Cosmos Hub experience and having emissions as high. I think every chain that made it through this bear market right, had a good hard look at their emissions and what they were getting, and like, and the question is like, what facilities do they have to claw those back? You know, the answer is not. They kind of made their bet. They
Yes.
yes.
Anyway, this was super interesting. It's given me a lot of food for thought. So thanks very much for coming on. That was a
This is great to be
super
here.
interesting chat.
Yeah. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Same here.
Thanks, Martin.